So in this chapter, we're going to replace a lot of the rectangles that we used as placeholders in the previous chapter with actual functioning controls. But the truth is that the music player only uses a relatively small number of controls, and I realized that this wouldn't give you a lot of exposure to the controls that WPF has to offer. And so to start off, what I wanted to do is actually give you kind of a broad tour, and we'll do that based on the base classes that the various controls derive from. So if you open up Project Files, and then open up Chapter 3, you'll notice in here there's a folder called Control Samples. And then if you look in Control Samples, you can see that we've broken that down into framework elements, controls, content controls, items controls, and range bases. And these actually correspond to the fundamental base classes that we typically use when we're creating new controls. So the first thing I want to do is let's take a look at some of the framework elements. So there's 3 XAML files in here, and each one of these XAML files is a sample that corresponds to the name of the file. So, for instance, in 1-border, we have a sample of how to use the border element. Now, in order to actually use these samples, we need to open them up in a tool like XAMLpad. Now, what I'm going to do is create an association between the XAML file type and XAMLpad, and you can do the same thing. The way you do that is by right-clicking on the file, choosing Open With from the menu, and then Choose Default Program. Now, it might be that Windows is smart enough to recommend XAMLpad for you like it has for me. And you can see that it's right here, so I'll select that. Otherwise, you can click on the Browse button down here, and then you can find XAMLpad.exe on your computer and choose that. Alternatively, if you're having a hard time finding XAMLpad.exe, you can just open it up with Notepad and then copy the paste into XAMLpad, and that will work just fine so you can follow along. So I'm going to make sure that this says always use the selected program to open this kind of file, and then click OK. Now you'll notice that it's opening up border.xaml for me right inside of XAMLpad. And this makes it really convenient for us to see these files. So let's go ahead and maximize this window and open it up so we can see the XAML. And let me tell you a little bit about border. So border is probably the element that I use more than any other element in WPF. And the reason for this is it's handy for many, many uses. I use it all the time, everything from just specifying a region in an application, or else you can even use nested borders to create 3D effects. Or sometimes you just need to put a border around something, so use it for that as well. Now if you look at the border, there are some obvious properties here, and some of these we've already encountered. So there's the property called width and a property called height. We know both of those. There's also a property here called background. When we've created other elements like the ellipse, we've encountered a property called fill. Background and fill essentially work the same way. It's just that shapes have the property called fill and borders have the property called background. And this is really for historical reasons. Historically, drawing elements have a fill and controls have a background. There's also a property here called border brush, and that's actually used to define the color or the brush for the border, and then a border thickness, and that's the thickness of the border. Now, one really useful thing to know about the border is that right here we're just using one value, but this is actually of type thickness, just like margin, and that gives us the ability to specify 4 different values for the border thickness. And those 4 different values will correspond to the left, top, right, and bottom sides. So, for example, we can change the border thickness to a value of 0, 0, 10, 10, like this. Alright, so as I did that, you saw that the text went red for just a minute. Again, that's an indication to me that XAMLpad couldn't interpret or parse something that I typed. I'm going to go ahead and turn off auto parse by clicking that button, and that means that from now on, whenever we want to refresh XAMLpad, we'll either have to click this button up here, called refresh, or we can also just press F5 and that would do the same thing. So now notice what happened when I set the border thickness to this value of 0, 0, 10, 10. You can see that now the border only shows up on the right and the bottom sides, and that's a border thickness of 10. Another really useful property on border is this property called corner radius. And this allows you to specify the radius of each of the corners on the border. So right now we've set that to a value of 10, but this can also have a 4-part value. So let's see what happens when I change the value of this property to 10, 100, 10, 100. Okay, when I hit F5 to refresh, you can see that when we do this, we keep the corner radius of the top left corner to 10, and then going around clockwise, the next corner is 100, then 10 again, and then finally 100. Now if we're going to use these colors, I think it's only fitting that we change the background to be yellow, and we'll make the border brush a yellow-green. And now if you work for a citrus company, go ahead and use this XAML for whatever purposes make the most sense. And then finally, like I mentioned earlier, a really useful property of a border is the fact that you can actually use it to draw a border around something. And what that means is the border actually has content. So let's draw a border around this border. We can do that by inserting a border element here. We'll set the width and the height properties to 250 by 250. The background to green. And the corner radius to 20. And then we'll add the close tag down below our original border. Okay, now if I hit F5 to refresh, you can see what happens. So now you can see that we've drawn a secondary border around the original border, and this really completes our lemon icon. All right, so that serves as a basic introduction to border. And really, I think border is a great element to get to know because it's really handy as you're creating UI and as you're creating other effects. So let's close out of this and we'll go look at the next element.